The gruesome discovery of the remains of 11 women and one unborn child.
Women believed connected to the West Mesa murders still not found.
Is still as fresh as ever.
This every day never goes away.
Whoever killed these 11 women was never caught.
Our sisters and mothers and friends were killed and buried on the West Mesa.
Serial killers are never considered anything but pathetic. However, there's something especially pathetic about a serial killer who targets others based on prejudice or because they perceive a certain class of people an easy kill. Even worse are the police who fail to act because of their own biases. Even in the early 2000s, and indeed now, it's apparent that police often prioritize certain victims, or rather, making certain people victims. This case is particularly frustrating as police never arrested any of their named suspects in relation to these murders. For once, the police aren't completely at fault for their inability to act, as late-stage capitalism washed away a large part of the evidence. Either way, at least 11 women lost their lives with no justice to be found. Hey everyone, it's Relic, and welcome back to my channel. As always, please check out the Petition and Charities in the description. Remember, signing petitions is a free way to make a difference. I'd also like to thank you for your support these past few years, however, this video isn't about me. Let's get to the West Mesa murders. Albuquerque, New Mexico is often characterized and remembered by its desert mountains and the infamous West Mesa. Unfortunately, what some see as beautiful scenery, some view as a dump site for the people they abduct and violate. This is the case for the West Mesa. Between 2001 and 2005, 11 women were buried in this area. They wouldn't be discovered until February of 2009, 4 to 8 years later depending on the victim. Let's remember the women who were taken advantage of by an unknown person or group. The first thing you'll notice about the victims is that they are all people of colour. This tells us that the women and girls were taken and or killed because of their shared characteristic, not being white. This may also be a factor in the lack of arrests made in the case. Furthermore, 9 of the 11 victims had previous convictions for drug possession or prostitution. Regardless of whether or not these women took part in criminal activity doesn't matter, as they are still victims who didn't deserve what happened to them. However, law enforcement may not believe this. There is a long history of women with convictions for drugs and sex work not being brought to justice due to the negligence and bias of police. Regardless, these women deserve their justice. The last of the remains to be identified belonged to 15-year-old Jamie Barela. On the day of her disappearance in April of 2004, she had been walking with her 23-year-old cousin Evelyn Salazar to a park in San Mateo. Although she wasn't identified until 2010, Jamie's mother knew for a fact that her daughter was among those in the mass grave. Her headstone reads, "Loved by all." She was still a child. When Monica Candelaria went missing in 2003 at the age of 21, her friends were adamant that it was foul play. The police turned her case over to the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit. Her case would stay cold until her remains were identified in 2009. The police were quick to dismiss letting her case go cold due to alleged gang ties and her living a high-risk lifestyle. That's never an excuse. Monica's family remember her as someone who enjoyed laughing, joking, taking care of babies, and spending time with her family. She will be remembered as a loving daughter, mother, granddaughter, niece, cousin, and friend who will truly be missed. This obituary will stand to time, and it's my hope that she's remembered for this rather than unproven alliances. Even if she were truly tied to a gang or gang activity, she did not deserve to have her life ended so abruptly and brutally. Victoria Chavez, 26, was the first of the women in West Mesa to be identified. She was reported missing in March of 2005 by her mother, who hadn't seen her in over a year. Unfortunately, Victoria had a drug dependency she fueled with selling her body, plus why her mother was used to Victoria being missing for extended periods of time. Regardless, her family were sure to make it known how loved she was, with the engraving on her headstone reading, "Beloved daughter, mother, and sister." She didn't deserve what happened to her. I can't stress this enough. Virginia Cloven was set on her path by tragedy. She had a great humour, loved doing makeup, and was popular with teachers in school. Unfortunately, in the later years of her high school career, her brother was shot and killed in a homicide that was later ruled as self-defense. The 17-year-old then ran away, choosing to live with her then boyfriend. Unfortunately, her partner was in an accident and went into a coma. She was now homeless and went down a path of substance abuse and sex work. Before she died, she attempted to reconnect with her family and get her life back on track. The killer or killers ripped that opportunity from her. She was still fondly remembered by her father Robert, who gave countless interviews before his death in 2019. Selenia Edwards was reported as an endangered missing at 15 years old in 2003 from Oklahoma. She had run away from foster care, an extremely common occurrence for children with unstable home environments. She was the only African American victim. The last potential sighting of Selenia was in Denver in the spring and summer of 2004. Anything else about the young girl is speculation, with police of course believing that she was a prostitute. They released a photo of her fingernail with a distinct design in hopes of getting in contact with someone who knew of Selenia's final year or two. She is unfortunately another child failed by the foster care system as well as those meant to protect her. Cinnamon Elks went missing in August of 2004. The then 32-year-old wouldn't be found until 2009 when the mass grave was uncovered. She was the third victim to be identified. Cinnamon's mother was adamant that something had happened to her daughter, begging the police to do something to track down her beloved daughter. Cinnamon may have been disregarded by the police due to her past record of arrests on counts of solicitation, as is common with law enforcement. Cinnamon is confirmed to have been friends with at least 3 of the other victims, possibly due to working the same job. She and her friends didn't deserve the negligence and prosecution law enforcement targeted them with. Doreen Marquez was around the age of 27 when she disappeared. Although the woman was not officially reported to have worked as a prostitute, with many disputing this claim, the police were adamant that she did. She had no criminal record, but due to her having similar characteristics to other missing persons at the time, police decided that she had to have been selling her body. There is an unbelievable amount of bias in the police's investigations in this case, as you will see later. Regardless, Marquez matched the characteristics of other victims, showing that specific women were being targeted. Towards the end of her short life, Marquez developed a drug dependency due to stressors in her life regarding her partner. Doreen's family still insisted that she visit in order to have meals with them and to come back permanently to live with them once she stopped using. It was around this time she disappeared. She would not be found until 6 years later. She was remembered fondly by family and friends for her huge personality, and her 2 children still often visit her grave to decorate it with butterflies and wind chimes. A tribute to her beauty and love. Nobody deserves the fate and injustice she had met. 23-year-old Julie Nieto led an extremely underprivileged life, just like the other women found in the West Mesa mass grave. At the age of 19, she began taking drugs to relieve her sense of depression and not being able to attain a job. Her mother tried to get her treatment, which was unsuccessful, though it's not known whether treatment was even available for the young woman. When she went missing, she had a young son who her mother is adamant she would not have left behind. She was a great mother, she wouldn't let that boy go for nothing, she said. Unfortunately, whoever was responsible for Julie's disappearance and death would cause another tragedy in the family by proxy. Julie's sister Valerie had lost the only sister she ever had and spiraled into a deep state of depression and anguish. Valerie took her own life 3 years after Valerie's disappearance. 2 years later, Julie was identified as one of the West Mesa women. The sisters were equally victims of the West Mesa murders, and neither should have had their lives cut short. In death, the two sisters lay side by side, finally reunited. Veronica Romero was reported missing by her family on Valentine's Day of 2004. She was 27 at the time. Her family are extremely private in their grief, refusing to give interviews beyond one made by Desiree Gonzalez. The woman didn't say much except to say, "We're putting her to rest finally, but considering what's been done, and now we're finding out more of what's happened to her, and it's sad. She was hurt real bad." Veronica Romero met a fate beyond brutality. The killer had no right. Evelyn Salazar was 23 when she disappeared. She was last seen with her cousin, 15-year-old Jamie Barela. They were the final two identifications made in this case. The two left a family gathering to go for a walk in the park. Evelyn had one conviction of prostitution, owing to why her case may have been left on the back burner. She had a great love of the outdoors, camping and cooking. A neighbour described her as a fun-loving, outgoing person who just loved and enjoyed life. She really loved being a mother. May she receive justice in her wrongful death. Michelle Valdez stopped visiting her father between 2004 and 2005. By this time, she had been disappearing for months at a time, but her father felt that something was wrong. She was reported missing in February of 2005. She would have been 22. By this time, she had a singular conviction of prostitution, her only way of attaining any form of money. Dan Valdez recalled that his daughter seemed to know something terrible was going to happen to her. She told him to hug her tight and hard on her final visit. She had struggled with drug addiction, which her family were aware of while still continuing to support her. Michelle desperately wanted to attend rehab, however she had no money or insurance, making treatment unavailable to her. Valdez had big dreams that she could not live out because of her addiction. However, she was never defined by it. Her family fondly remember her as being extremely bubbly and always smiling despite her troubles. She should have led a long life, raising the baby that died with her after her murder. Michelle was 4 months pregnant when her life was taken from her. Those are the confirmed victims of the West Mesa murders, also known as the 118th Street killings. However, there may be 6 more. In 2019, Albuquerque Police Department's Lieutenant Norris gave an interview at the University of New Mexico's radio station. The police are convinced that there are 6 more victims of the bone collector. They are convinced that these 6 women are dead and buried somewhere, and with the discovery of their bodies will bring the end to that manhunt for the serial killer which left such a haunting mark on New Mexico. Dan Valdez turned his loss into advocacy, becoming spokesperson for the families and victims of the West Mesa murders until 2015. He would not see his daughter's case be solved. His final statement was, "God, I wish we had some answers. We all meet our maker in the end anyway. We'll get our justice, maybe not here on Earth, but we'll get our justice." If the sheriff's deputies had actually listened to the loved ones of the victims sooner, this case may very well have been solved before the amount of victims doubled. Sheriff's deputies investigating the disappearance of Monica Candelaria in 2003 heard from her friends that she had been killed and buried on the mesa. They decided not to follow this lead. As the West Mesa Desert is considered public property and that anyone may visit the area without fear of prosecution, police would not have had to secure any form of warrant in order to investigate. While what they heard from the friends of Monica Candelaria may have been passed off as gossip or hearsay, their conviction and belief in this was adamant. However, if Monica's friends were under the influence of any form of drug or alcohol, their statements would be considered invalid. However, the women's family and friends were already leaving memorials in the West Mesa Desert long before the mass grave was ever found. An actual investigation would not begin until mid-2005. The families of the victims are still adamant the police made no effort to find the women after they disappeared. Perhaps there's a reason that police never bothered to search for the women or to make any arrests. It's entirely possible that this theory is a baseless rumour, as is often the case with unsolved cases. Many residents of Albuquerque and followers of the West Mesa murders believe that there is a cover-up involved in the case protecting the killer. Historically, police never cared enough about the murders of addicts and those who partook in prostitution. In fact, oftentimes they would consider it helpful for them, as killers would clean up the streets. This same belief also applied in cases where LGBTQ+ men and women were killed. Or perhaps it was an officer of the law doing the so-called cleaning up. Shortly before Cinnamon Elks disappeared in August of 2004, she supposedly began telling friends that there was a dirty cop who was chopping off the heads of prostitutes and burying them on the West Mesa. To this date, the causes of death of the women found in the desert bowl has not been identified, making this claim impossible to validate. Regardless, if this were true and Cinnamon did make this claim before her abduction and eventual murder, it's entirely possible she was murdered to make her shut up. Halfway through the string of disappearances, a detective in the area named Ida Lopez took notice of the patterns in this case. She realized that many of the missing persons in Albuquerque had some connection to drugs and prostitution. She made a complete list of missing women who fit this category. 10 of the West Mesa victims were on this list. Selenia Edwards was not on the list due to the fact that she did not go missing from Albuquerque. Police Detective Lopez became intensely attached to the case, to this day working with families and law enforcement to be an advocate for these missing women in her retirement. Before the discovery of the body pit beside an often used street in the Mesa, the police were not at all helpful in searching for the missing women, besides Detective Lopez, that is. Even in retirement, she has dedicated herself to finding the culprit behind these crimes. It wasn't until the dumping site was found that the police would bother investigating. Years-long missing persons cases would be finally solved on the 2nd of February 2009. Christine Ross and her dog Ruka were taking a walk on the wash, with Ruka off the leash. The dog found something of interest: a bone. Christine saw her dog's find and texted a photo to her sister, a registered nurse. Her sister replied to identify the bone: a human femur. Christine phoned the police and directed them to the area where Ruka had made the unsettling discovery. Even more unsettling was the fact that there were 11 women found in the pit. Recovering the bodies from this pit would be a monumental task, as authorities tried to recover the women without damaging their bodies. Any damage to the bones could have hidden a clue or injury which would lead to the police apprehending the West Mesa bone collector, as media had dubbed the anonymous killer. The burial site was considered the largest in American history, as the empty lot was 100 acres in size. The body recovery unit worked around the clock, digging and sifting through piles of desert dirt to find even the smallest shards of evidence and bone. This went on for over 2.5 months. By early April, they effectively ended the dig, saying that they were confident they had found 90% of the bones. In response to this discovery, land developers and owners of the lot KB Home promised the community and families that they would build a commemorative park in memory of the women found on their land. Over 13 years later, they still haven't made good on that promise. On the 25th of April 2009, the same day the dig officially ended, the case was featured on America's Most Wanted. Although the case had featured on some national newspapers and media outlets before this, the response was phenomenal. However, while this move would expose the circumstances to millions more people, it also drew in less than savoury characters. Albuquerque police began to receive hundreds of bogus calls, most notably from self-proclaimed psychics who claimed to have information. This information would be easily disproven. During the course of this, 7 of the victims had been identified. Police labelled the crimes related, but refused to admit that a serial offender or group were behind the missing and murdered women of Albuquerque. Eventually, rumors began to run rampant, and these rumors began to gain traction online, growing into an echo chamber of so-called conspiracy theorists trying to pin the murders on the police. This spiraled out of control when journalists reported that the victims' families were told in meetings by police to keep quiet and refrain from voicing their opinions at all. To the families, it felt as though police were silencing them in an attempt to sweep their daughters' murders under the rug, just as they did with their disappearances. This would cause America and the world to put pressure on the Albuquerque law enforcement as their investigation continued. What is classified as an investigation can vary between definitions. Mostly, the forensic work is included in the classification. However, as this investigation is ongoing, much of the information they have found has not been released or has not been useful to the investigation. This includes the autopsies performed, cause of death, and information on what happened to the women before they were killed. While the coroner was able to determine that the cause of death was homicidal violence, no forensic or medical experts could find any proof of what caused the women's deaths. However, the timeline of the investigation is well recorded. While extracting DNA from the women and children found in the pit, authorities tested every shred of evidence for foreign DNA, or DNA that did not belong to any of the 11 victims. The only DNA they ever found in the pit and on the women's remains all belonged to the women. This would suggest that either there was no sexual activity or the killer used some form of protection. This would also suggest that any DNA on the clothing the women were wearing disintegrated along with the fabrics. While clothes left on their own will take about 40 to 50 years to break down, clothing on a cadaver can disintegrate and be fully decomposed within a few weeks to 5 years. Regardless, this left police with no viable suspects. From the beginning, the investigation into the West Mesa murders relied heavily on the public. The FBI began to draw up a psychological profile. In the meantime, Albuquerque officers began going door to door asking for information on the final months of the victims' lives. Unfortunately, for the majority of the victims, their disappearance wasn't noticed until it was too late. The only true lead in terms of evidence in this case comes from a series of satellite photos from during the time at which the original 16 women had disappeared, not just the confirmed victims. Chillingly, satellite images taken in 2004 showed a set of tire tracks leading directly to the body pit. Unfortunately, due to the image being taken in 2004, the quality is not clear enough to identify any form of tire tracks, even after image enhancement. By the time that the women were found, some building development on the site had erased anything which could have possibly held any forensic value. It was around this time that the Albuquerque Police Department came under scrutiny, and not just for their lacking investigation. In recent years, the city announced that the Department of Justice would be monitoring the police's investigation. This announcement came after a civil investigation found immensely alarming patterns of behaviour in the unit. Between 2009 and 2012, officers in Albuquerque killed 20 individuals. The Department of Justice concluded that the majority of these killings were unconstitutional. Furthermore, many scandals and accusations have been made against the police in this city. Most notably, there have been many accusations by local sex workers that a state police officer and one Albuquerque policeman had sexually assaulted them. This truly showcases how some law enforcement think of sex workers and women. They see them as subhuman. Unfortunately, this has clearly clouded their judgment and perception of justice. What was once a 40-person task force is now a responsibility shouldered by only one detective. However, this detective's theories are the strongest indication of who may be behind the West Mesa murders. Over the years, the pool of suspects has been whittled down little by little, mostly due to the timeline put together by Detective Mark Mannery. After taking over the case full-time in 2014, he was able to put together an accurate timeline of the final movements of the women victimized by the West Mesa bone collector. It was this combination of historical events and alibis given by suspects that brought the suspect down to just 2 individuals. That is, if you believe that this was the work of one man and not a group of people. Many believe that the 118th Street killings are actually the work of a human trafficking ring operating in Texas, which has ties and accessibility to the southwest, southern, and western United States. In October of 2020, a sex trafficking ring was discovered, one which was targeting women in New Mexico to kidnap, buy, and sell. 2 men from South Carolina and Texas were arrested after it was found that they had bought and sold a Santa Fe woman using Albuquerque as a transport hub. The Texas man met the woman on a dating app in 2019. They met up and the man used a gun to coerce her to stay with him before selling her for $5,000. The woman was rescued 4 months later after a healthcare worker flagged the woman as meeting the criteria for a trafficking victim. These 2 men were just a small fragment of a large trafficking ring still operating in these areas. It's this particularly shady organization that some people believe are behind the deaths of the West Mesa 11. Meanwhile, some believe that the killer is far more local. Before the confirmation of alibis, there were 5 suspects, each with long lists of unsavory past history. Fred Reynolds was a renowned pimp in the area and well known by the police. At the age of 60, and just 1 month before the body pit was discovered, Reynolds died in his home due to natural causes. Although the police found several photos of the murdered women in Reynolds' home, no physical evidence linking him to the 11 West Mesa victims was found. In fact, as recently as October of 2008, it was found that the man was reaching out to the families of the murdered women, apparently concerned for their well-being. He stated that as a former heroin addict, he wanted nothing more than to help the women that worked for him and give them a good life. Police do not believe him to be connected to the crimes at all. October of 2009 marked justice for then 47-year-old Scott Kimball. After spending years as an FBI informer, it was discovered that he was responsible for the murders of 4 people in Colorado between 2003 and 2004. While he pleaded guilty to these 4 murders, he denied being the man behind the 118th Street killings. At the age of 51, Robert Howard Bruce made it clear what a vile human being he is. It was 2013 and Bruce was going to see repercussions for his actions from 1985 to 2006. During this time period, women in Norman, Oklahoma were terrorized by this evil man who had followed them home or hid in their houses in order to assault them. After an incident in 2012 where Bruce was caught staring in the window of a woman, his DNA was entered in the database and compared to sexual crimes in the area. He was immediately linked to the string of sexual assaults in Oklahoma. Bruce was sentenced to a total of 177 years in prison for 19 counts of first-degree rape, sexual battery, sodomy, and first-degree burglary. While he is still under investigation for sexual crimes in Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, police are certain that he isn't the perpetrator behind the West Mesa murders. Finally, we have Ron Irwin from Joplin, Missouri. It's not known how Irwin came to police's attention. Maybe it was his general creepy vibe, or the fact that he often visited Albuquerque. For whatever reason, the police secured a warrant to search several of the man's properties. During this raid, they found tens of thousands of photos of women, notably with several of them being related to the West Mesa victims. However, the man was cleared as a suspect. Finally, we have the 2 men who were not named as suspects but still have that possibility attributed to them. Both of these men were active in the time span at which the 11 victims went missing from 2001 to 2005. Thankfully, neither of them are on the streets anymore. Lorenzo Montoya lived in West Mesa, making a humble living working for a printing company. His humble trailer where he lived, alone, was less than 3 miles from the dump site where the women's bodies were found. The man had a habit of picking up prostitutes and assaulting them. An ex-girlfriend also testified that he had beaten her and threatened to kill and bury her in lime. Little did he know that baiting his final victim would bring his untimely death. On December 19th of 2006, 39-year-old Montoya met 19-year-old Sherika Hill in a chat room. Sherika was a dancer looking for work. She often met clients online and made appointments there. The two arranged for the girl to meet Montoya at his trailer in the early hours of the morning. Hill never made arrangements without informing her boyfriend, Frederick Williams. Williams drove Hill to the mobile home on the edge of town, parking down the street so as to not alert Montoya. Hill entered the trailer while Williams waited in the car. After over an hour, Williams became concerned for Hill's well-being, as she hadn't walked out to the car. The man decided to go and check on her. From there, the story becomes murky, as we only have Williams' versions of events, as well as the fact that there are conflicting reports that exist today. Keep in mind that the version of events I'm about to give you may not be accurate. Although the series of events is disputed, there is no argument about what happened to Sherika. Williams discovered her dead body as he approached the trailer. In fact, Montoya was in the middle of transporting her between the trailer and his car when Williams approached. Williams shot Montoya, killing him presumably after some kind of argument or because Montoya was brandishing a gun. The shooting of Lorenzo Montoya was ruled to be self-defense. When police arrived at the trailer in the early morning, they were aghast at the seemingly practiced way in which Montoya killed Hill. The two had had sex before Montoya decided to strangle her. After she stopped breathing, he bound her ankles, knees, and wrists with duct tape and calmly began preparations to dispose of the girl. This implies that he killed for sexual fulfillment. This level of premeditation led police to believe that Montoya had been killing like this for some time. Furthermore, the man had prior prostitution-related convictions. Montoya was known to prowl the East Central Corridor looking for women to exert violence onto. In 1998, the man was arrested after attempting to solicit an undercover police officer for $40. After the officer brought Montoya back to a motel, a team of officers lying in wait arrested him. This wouldn't prevent him from further trying to solicit women for sex, or harm them. In 1999, detectives were trailing Montoya when they caught him picking up a sex worker and bringing her to a dead-end road close to the airport. Police intervened as he began to get violent with the woman. Police believed that without their intervention, Montoya would have raped and killed the woman. He was strangling her when they intervened. They also found only $2 in his wallet. Montoya had not intended to pay the sex worker. He was arrested before the case was dismissed. 4 years later, detectives once again caught the man picking up a sex worker. After his arrest, the sex worker told police that he had paid her $15. This claim could be the reason he got away with solicitation, as it would be 3 years later that Montoya would meet and murder Sherika Hill. Evidence following this murder would only serve to incriminate Montoya. To this day, he's one of the main suspects in the West Mesa murders. Inside Montoya's trailer following Sherika Hill's murder, disturbing details would make themselves known. Among the man's possessions, they found duct tape next to the bed, as well as hardcore pornography and homemade tapes of the same caliber. In their investigation, police found one tape that begins with Montoya having sex with a woman before the camera goes black. The following scene captures the bedroom wall while audio is still recording. Tape can be heard being pulled from a roll before at least one trash bag is opened and rustling noises are heard. The FBI and other crime labs have studied the tape but could not confirm what had happened without video feed. After the discovery of the body pit in the West Mesa 2 years later, Montoya became one of the top people on the suspect list. Police have never conclusively tied the man to the murders despite numerous tests in their investigation. A spokesman in the case gave details of this investigation, saying that they had tested the carpet in Montoya's trailer for DNA to compare it to the victims of the West Mesa murders. This came back negative. There was also nothing suspicious in Montoya's financial records from the times in which the women in the pit went missing. The man's family have refused to be interviewed by the media, but some of their interviews with police were released in an affidavit. Montoya's own mother commented on how the man had been aggressive and violent in his early years, but he had changed and was good to her. Though police couldn't link the man to the West Mesa murders, police announced they were attempting to locate 2 escorts found in some of the homemade tapes they found in his trailer. The aforementioned spokesperson claimed that this was to ascertain that the women were still alive. Though the murders stopped after Montoya's death, there is one other suspect in this case who has gained police's attention. Aside from the surmounted evidence against Montoya, there's one other notable suspect in this case who has a similar record of violence and aggression. Joseph Blea caught the attention of detectives almost immediately after the West Mesa body pit was discovered. However, it wasn't the investigation or an eyewitness who tied him to the crimes. It was Blea's own ex-wife. 7 days after the missing women were unearthed from the pit, April Gillen claimed that they should look into her ex-husband. Police found this an easy link due to Blea's prior behaviours which made him known to them. Blea is currently serving a 90-year sentence in connection with 4 sexual assaults not linked to the West Mesa case. This string of horrific crimes led the horrible man to be dubbed the mid-school rapist. I've read the court transcripts and will spare you the awful details, but Blea assaulted 4 young girls and kidnapped them, being found guilty on multiple charges, including first-degree kidnapping, first-degree criminal sexual penetration, and some other things. The appeal transcript will be listed under sources in the description. Keep in mind it is extremely difficult to read because of the content. Blea's appeal would be turned down. Other allegations, including raping a 14-year-old with a foreign object and killing a prostitute, have been thrown out of court or resulted in Blea never being charged. Even before these court cases and allegations, the mid-school rapist was known to police. Between 1990 and 2009, police were alerted to his behaviour over 130 times. Many of these reports and encounters were along the East Central Corridor, the area where many West Mesa murder victims went missing from or frequented. One of these encounters included a report to police where it was detailed that Blea had called a woman over to his car and exposed himself to her. Police found electrical tape and rope in his passenger seat over the course of interrogating him about his public indecency. This was 6 years before the discovery of the West Mesa victims. After the discovery, police were tailing Blea to observe his behaviour. They found that he was actively stalking prostitutes. Detectives wrote up a warrant to interrogate him in connection with the West Mesa murders. On 2 separate occasions, Mr. Blea drove Central Avenue from the west part of Albuquerque to the east part of Albuquerque, the detective wrote in the warrant. He slowed and circled the block in areas where prostitutes were working. He did not approach any prostitutes, but appeared to be closely watching them. During the investigation into Blea, police questioned a sex worker who knew of him. She claimed the mid-school rapist took her to his house and attempted to tie her up. She wouldn't let him. Blea's home yielded some interesting evidence that, if nothing, showed a form of paraphilia or a penchant for taking trophies from victims. As a reminder, I'm not a psychologist or qualified in psychology in any way, however it's a major interest of mine and I read a lot of peer-reviewed articles in my research and because of my interest in the field. The reason I believe this evidence to pertain to paraphilia rather than trophy taking is because of the statements made by Blea's ex-wife. Regardless, a paraphilia is a persistent and recurrent sexual interest, urges, fantasies, or behavior of marked intensity involving objects, activities, or even situations that are atypical in nature. In Blea's case, there seems to be a form of fetishistic paraphilic disorder or transvestic disorder. Please keep in mind that transvestic disorder is not the same as being transgender. Being transgender is not a disorder, while transvestic disorder is marked as a disorder in that the person with the paraphilia identifies as their birth sex, but needs to participate in their paraphilia to be satiated sexually. Paraphilics are often obsessively fixated on their paraphilias. Paraphilias are much more powerful than a mere fetish. Transgenderism is not a fetish. In terms of Joseph Blea, he had an obsession with having and hiding feminine underwear and jewellery. His ex-wife ascertained that all of the feminine underwear and items found on his property during the investigation did not belong to her or her daughter. She also noted to police that the mid-school rapist often wore this underwear during sex because he enjoyed it. Nothing really came of the underwear, excuse the pun, but for a moment I'd like to talk about this jewellery. Many of the West Mesa victims' jewellery wasn't recovered with the bodies, however, investigators have refused to disclose whether or not the victim's DNA was on jewellery recovered from Blea's home. This statement was made in 2016 and claimed that since this is an ongoing investigation, these details cannot be released. However, if that were the case, and the DNA were on the jewellery, wouldn't that be a big break in the case to further prove Blea's guilt? I believe the victim's DNA is in fact on the items, as well as other missing persons in the area. Obviously, this is just speculation, but if it were the case that the victim's DNA or that other missing person's DNA is not on the items, why not just say so? There must be relevant evidence linked to that jewellery and underwear. Other circumstantial evidence lent itself to the face of guilt belonging to Blea. Former cellmates of his claimed that the mid-school rapist said he had known many of the West Mesa murder victims, going so far as to say he'd paid many of them for sex. He called the victims trashy, as well as many other unsavory words. One cellmate even claimed that Blea laughed about beating a victim when she tried to take payment for her service. Laying among this slew of circumstantial evidence is one piece of actual physical evidence. A plant tag for a spearmint juniper found in the pit next to Virginia cloven. This tree tag would be proven to be from a tree nursery in California which often sends plants to Albuquerque. Evidence of a purchase of spearmint junipers was found in Blea's business records. Whether or not this tag was ever directly linked to Blea is unclear. Blea's former lawyer claims that the monster relented in that he had nothing to do with the murders and denied all involvement. Regardless, he is a proven monster and he won't be going anywhere should the police need to interrogate him in regards to the West Mesa murders.
In 2018, another body would be uncovered in a park just half a mile south of where the original West Mesa bodies were discovered. After this reveal, there was a revival of interest in the West Mesa murders, with many speculating that this body would give families closure, while also revealing the identities of the West Mesa bone collector. As it would turn out, the bodies unearthed in the development site would be older than the women and children in 118th Street. Much, much older. The body found was indigenous and from the years 1100 to 1300 AD. This new lead would turn out to be nothing more than developers desecrating a burial site. There have been no updates on these remains, much like there have been no updates in the West Mesa murders case.
As I mentioned before, 10 of the 11 confirmed West Mesa murder victims made it onto a preliminary list of missing persons who shared characteristics. Only these 10 from an unconfirmed number have been found. There could be 20 or even 100 women and girls on this list, all with families who don't know what happened to them. In 2010, police released several photos of 7 unidentified women who they were searching for in connection with the West Mesa murders. Authorities refused to disclose where they got these images from, but resemblances to the confirmed victims were uncanny. Horrifyingly, many of the women pictured were unconscious or at least appeared to be. A few days after they released these images, police confirmed that 2 women in the photos were alive and may have valuable information should they be located. Nothing about these women or the aftermath was released. Police are still at square one, 13 years later. The final piece of evidence in this case is a phone call made to police by someone claiming to know who the killer is. Please contact Crime Stoppers if you recognize the voice in this clip.
You know who I am.
We're just heading south of Beaumont, or north of Beaumont.
I know Nina. I know who killed her.
And where the f*** these roads going to?
50th Street.
50th Street. Are you sure?
Absolutely.
No, where are we going?
50th Street.
50th Street?
50th Street.
East, right?
I know who killed her, and I know who did it. And I know why. Okay, bye.
This February, it will have been 14 years since the discovery of the West Mesa women. It's been even longer since their families have seen their family members for the last time. Like any cold case, this investigation relies heavily on information from the public in order to bring justice to the victims. Jamie Barela, Monica Candelaria, Victoria Chavez, Virginia Cloven, Selenia Edwards, Cinnamon Elks, Doreen Marquez, Julie Nieto, Veronica Romero, Evelyn Salazar, and Michelle Valdez are among the millions of BIPOC women and children whose disappearances and murders have never been solved. It is up to the public to advocate and spread awareness of missing and endangered people as well as unsolved murders. This is why I've chosen two amazing charities to feature in this episode. Be sure to check out Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Black and Missing in the description and leave a donation if you can. You will also find a petition related to this issue in the description. Ghosts links and the link to my Discord server are also in the description. If you have any information regarding the West Mesa murders, please call the APD or email them with the contact information on screen. These women have no advocate since Virginia Cloven's father died. More than ever now, they need somebody to stand up for them and remind police that they were women and girls who disappeared and who were failed by the systems put in place to protect them, as well as the police who never bothered to properly investigate their disappearances until it was too late.